there is a question that troubles those who walk too long among the ancient stones of the central Mediterranean. A question that quietly dismantles the comfortable chronology of human history if one dares to follow it to the end. Before the first pharaoh ever lifted a flail in the Nile Valley, before the first cuneiform stylus pressed wet clay in Sumer, before Stonehenge had even been dreamed into the chalk soil of Salisbury Plain, someone on a small island in the warm sea between Sicily and Africa lifted blocks of stone the weight of small ships and arranged them with mathematical precision into structures that still stand today. Who they were, no one knows. Before you let your body sink fully into this stillness, take a moment to give this video a quiet acknowledgement, a like, perhaps a subscription. But only if what you hear truly speaks to something inside you. And if you would, in the words beneath, leave a small note. The place you are listening from, the hour shown on your clock. It softens something in a wandering soul to know who else is awake among the old stones tonight. The island in question is called Malta, a fragment of limestone and dust afloat in the warm sea between Sicily and the coast of Tunisia. It is small. From the tip of one shore to the other, a slow walker could cross it in a single afternoon. Its population today fits comfortably into a mid-sized European city. And yet, on this little outcrop of rock and on its sister island of Gozo just across a narrow strait, more megalithic temples were raised than survive anywhere else on Earth from the same depth of antiquity. Older than the pyramids of Giza by nearly 1,000 years. Older than the famous stone circles of Britain by more than a millennium. Older even than the first cities of Mesopotamia, when those cities were still villages of mud brick and reeds. The temples have names that the modern Maltese still pronounce with a strange combination of pride and reluctance. Ġgantija, Ħaġar Qim, Mnajdra, Tarxien, Skorba, Bugiba. Each one a complex of curved stone walls, megalithic doorways, sculpted altars, and apsidal chambers laid out in a pattern that exists nowhere else in the prehistoric world. The largest single block within them weighs in the neighbourhood of 50 tons. The total weight of stone moved, cut, and set in place by these forgotten architects has been estimated at well over 6,000 tons across the principal sites alone. 6,000 tons of limestone, hauled and lifted and shaped, on an island that produced no copper, no bronze, no wheel, no draft animals large enough to bear that burden. It is a fact that archaeologists rarely state plainly, because to state it plainly is to open a door that mainstream science prefers to keep half closed. The official chronology says that between roughly 3,600 and 2,500 before the Common Era, a small population of farmers, perhaps no more than 10,000 souls at any one time, quarried, transported and erected these monuments using nothing but stone hammers, fire, water, ropes of vegetable fibre and an abundance of patience. The official chronology is almost certainly correct in its broad outline, and yet the question lingers. Why here? Why this island, and not the rich plains of Anatolia or the river valleys of the Nile? Why this density of monumental architecture in a place that had no obvious wealth, no nearby empire to imitate, no foreign teachers to copy from? The Maltese themselves long carried an answer in their folklore, not in the dry registers of foreign antiquarians, but in the kitchens and on the doorsteps of villages, where stories passed from grandmother to grandchild long before the first English archaeologists set foot on the island. The answer was simple and strange. The temples were not built by people, they were built by giants. By a single giantess, in some versions of the tale, named Sansuna, who carried the great stones on her head while nursing an infant at her breast. In other versions, by a vanished race of immense beings whose memory the small island had inherited along with their stones. The folklore is not history. But folklore, as anyone who has listened carefully to it knows, is a strange kind of fossil. It preserves something, it just does not always preserve what one expects. When the first proper excavators arrived in the early 19th century, they smiled at the stories of giants and went about measuring the ruins with chains and theodolites. They cleared the rubble, they recorded the alignments, they catalogued the figurines of obese seated women, the carvings of spirals and lozenges, the strange repeated motif of an opening shaped like a doorway leading nowhere. They named the cultures by ceramic phases, Ġgantija, Saflieni, Tarxien, and they assigned dates that grew older and older with each refinement of radiocarbon technique. By the closing decades of the 20th century, the dates had settled into a sequence so ancient that no comparable architecture existed anywhere in Europe or the Eastern Mediterranean at the same period. Malta, in other words, was the cradle of something. But of what, and for whom, no one could quite say. And then, around 2500 before the Common Era, something happened. The temples stopped being used. The population that had built them, whoever they were, vanished from the archaeological record almost without trace. No burnt layers from invasion. No mass graves from plague large enough to confirm such a cause. No long decline of inferior structures gradually replacing the old. The pattern is closer to a door quietly closing than to a city being sacked. The Bronze Age people who later occupied the island did not continue the temple tradition. They did not even preserve its meaning. They camped in the abandoned chambers, used some of the stones for the walls of their huts, and forgot. Forgot so completely that within a few generations the temples themselves were folded into the rumour of giants. 6,000 tons of stone raised by an unknown people, abandoned for no known catastrophe, remembered only as the work of a creature who never existed. That is the puzzle that will be turned slowly, hour by hour, in the dim light of these long minutes. It is not a puzzle that promises a single answer. It promises something stranger and perhaps more useful. The recognition that the story of human history, as it is taught and retold, may be missing entire chapters, and that some of those missing chapters lie in plain sight, on a small island in a warm sea, in stones that have been waiting patiently for someone to ask them the right question. On Gozo, the smaller of the two main islands, the temple still bears the name the people themselves gave it, Ġgantija. The word is Maltese, and it does not pretend to be anything else. It comes from Gant, a giant, with the feminine suffix attached. The Temple of the Giantess. Not a name imposed by foreign scholars in their study halls of Florence or Oxford, but a name that older villagers were already using when the first chains of measurement were laid across the rubble of the central courtyard in the year 1827. The temple had a name long before it had an excavation. The temple had a name long before anyone could read its stones. The people of Gozo, who in the early 19th century lived simply in flat-roofed limestone houses around the slope of the Ġagra plateau, walked past the silent enclosure for centuries and knew, with the certainty that only inherited memory can give, who had built it. They had built it, the elders said, the ones who came before, the ones who were too tall for any door, who needed no scaffolding to lift the stones, who left their tools behind because no one alive could lift them after. There was a name for the chief among the builders, Sansuna, a woman, a mother. The story, as it was told in the small kitchens above the silent ruins, was almost domestic in its imagery. Sansuna had been pregnant, or she had been nursing. Some versions made her both at once. She had carried the great stones on the crown of her head, balanced there as a Mediterranean village woman of any century might balance a clay jar of water, and while she carried them, she had suckled her child. The image is strange in its tenderness. It is not the image of a monster, but of a worker so vast that the work no one alive could accomplish was, for her, a kind of housekeeping. The image has the texture of memory rather than the texture of invention. It does not seek to terrify, it seeks to explain. Folklorists of the 19th century, when they bothered to write the legend down at all, did so with a tone of polite condescension. The antiquarian Cesare Vassallo, librarian of the Royal Public Library of Malta, recorded several versions of the Sansuna tale in his catalogues and notes during the middle decades of that century. He did not believe in giants. No educated man of the Enlightenment believed in giants. But he was careful enough to record the story because he sensed, perhaps, that the story was older than his own confidence in chronology. Other compilers followed. The legend appeared in the popular pamphlets of the Maltese folk revival in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and from there into the early tourist literature that began to bring strangers up the path toward the Ħaġar Ridge. By then the temple had been excavated, its plan revealed, its stones counted, and still the local guides, almost apologetically, repeated the name Ġgantija, the temple of the giantess. They did not insist. They simply said it and let the visitors make of it what they would. What is to be made of a name? Linguists who study folk taxonomy, the strange and stubborn way that ordinary people name the strange things in their landscape, have noted that such names often outlive the events that produced them by extraordinary spans of time. In Brittany, the dolmens are called by names that invoke fairies and the small underground people, and the Breton peasantry have insisted on these names for so long that no one alive can say how long. In Cornwall, the standing stones bear the names of petrified women who danced on Sunday, and the villages around them have transmitted this story from generation to generation for centuries without knowing why. In the German lands, certain Bronze Age burial mounds bear names that evoke giants and dwarfs, and these names appear in legal documents from the early medieval period in forms already presumed ancient. The pattern is consistent. When a population inherits a monument it did not build, and whose builders it cannot remember, it tends to attribute the monument to a class of beings outside ordinary humanity. The giants, the fairies, the old ones, the ones who came before. Whether such beings ever existed in any literal sense is a question that responsible inquiry must set aside. What cannot be set aside is the function of the name. The name preserves an awareness, the awareness that the structure is not the work of the present community, the awareness that something happened long ago, that the present community has lost the means to describe. The folklore of giants, in this reading, is not an error to be corrected. It is a marker placed in the soil of memory at the precise point where memory itself ran out. Beyond this marker, the elders are saying we do not know. Beyond this marker, only the giants. There is one further detail in the Maltese folklore that deserves to be noticed. In several versions of the Sansuna legend, the giantess does not build alone. She's part of a race that lived on the islands before the people who tell the story arrived. A race that was, depending on the version, either driven out by a great flood, or destroyed by the sun, or simply ceased to be, leaving their monuments to be inherited by the small humans who came after. The flood appears repeatedly, so does the sense of a sudden and total disappearance. The folklore does not describe a gradual decline, it describes a vanishing. And as the chapters of this long inquiry unfold, the listener will find that the archaeological record itself, when read with patient attention, says something disquietingly similar. The temples were used, and then they were not used. The population built, and then it did not build. Between the last carved spiral and the first Bronze Age camp on the same site, there is a silence that the official chronology fills with the polite phrase cultural discontinuity. A polite phrase, perhaps, for something the local grandmothers had a different name for. The visitor who walks the Ħaġar Ridge today, in the early hours of a Maltese morning, before the heat has settled into the limestone, can see the temple from a long distance off. It rises out of the dust the way a sleeping body rises out of a bed. The outer wall of coralline limestone curves gently inward. The doorway is taller than a man. The blocks lining the inner chambers are taller still. The builders, whoever they were, designed the entrance to a scale that does not quite fit the bodies of the people whose bones have been found inside. It is a small detail. It is the sort of detail that an honest investigator notices once, sets aside, and finds difficult to forget. Whose proportions did they have in mind? The history of how the temples were rediscovered is, in its own quiet way, a story of accidents, of farmers turning over soil and striking stone where no stone should have been, of British colonial officers walking out for an afternoon stroll and noticing in the slanting light that the irregularity in the field was not an irregularity at all, but the curve of a wall, of foundation trenches dug for cisterns that suddenly opened into chambers no living person had entered. The temples, it appears, didn't stay buried because they were well hidden. They stayed buried because no one was looking for them, and the moment someone began to look, they came out of the earth one after another in a sequence so steady that the catalogue of Maltese archaeology, by the early 20th century, had begun to resemble a slow and steady exhumation rather than a methodical investigation. The first of them to be cleared in any systematic way was Ġgantija itself, on the Ẓagra plateau of Gozo. The year was 1827. The work was conducted under the supervision of Colonel John Otto Bayer, a German officer in the service of the British colonial administration. He was not a trained archaeologist. He was a soldier with antiquarian inclinations, and he ordered the surrounding rubble cleared with the efficiency of a man directing a military engineering project. Drawings were made, plans were sketched, stones were moved that should not have been moved, and finds were collected that were never properly recorded. By the standards of modern scientific excavation, the work was a disaster. By the standards of its own moment, it was the first time anyone had attempted to render the temple legible to outside eyes. What emerged from beneath the soil shocked the small community of European antiquarians who heard about it. A monumental complex of curved walls and apsidal chambers, built of stones too large for any reasonable explanation, and clearly older than anything that ought to exist on so small an island. Then, in 1839, the first soundings began at Ħaġar Qim, on the southern coast of the main island. The cluster of megaliths there had never been entirely buried. Some of the great upright stones had always stood above the surface of the field, leaning at strange angles, dismissed by passing villagers as the remains of something old and not worth discussing. A few of them were so large that the farmers of the surrounding valley had simply ploughed around them for generations. When the work of clearing began, the soil was found to be shallow. The temple had been waiting in plain sight beneath only a thin skin of earth and weed. A few feet down, the floors emerged, then the altars, then the famous fat-bodied statuettes, the so-called Venuses of Malta, with their immense thighs and their tiny heads. The same year, just a few hundred metres down the slope toward the sea, a second temple was identified at Mnajdra. Twin complex, southern face, oriented in some way no one yet understood toward the rising of the sun. The pace of discovery, once begun, did not slow. In 1902, the strangest discovery of all came to light, and it came by complete accident. Workmen on the small Maltese town of Paula were digging the foundations for new houses in the residential district of Ħal Saflieni. The plan was modest, a row of dwellings to accommodate the growing families of the three cities district. Cisterns needed to be carved into the soft globigerina limestone beneath each house, as was the custom on the island. Into one such cistern shaft, a workman lowered himself with a rope and a candle. He went deeper than expected. The shaft did not end where shafts of that size were supposed to end. It opened, abruptly, into a chamber, and then into another chamber beyond it, and then into a third, lower still, with walls covered in spirals painted in red ochre. The workmen, frightened, withdrew. Their foreman was summoned. The houses, half built, were eventually completed above the discovery, but the discovery itself, once the authorities had been notified, was preserved. It was named the Hypogeum, from the Greek for the place beneath the earth. It had been beneath the earth for at least 4,000 years, and no one alive had known it was there. The Hypogeum is unlike any other prehistoric structure in the world. It is not a temple in the open air like Ġgantija or Ħaġar Qim. It is the inverse of a temple. It is a temple carved downward into the living rock, 3 full levels deep, with chambers that imitate the architecture of the above-ground temples in negative space. Pilasters carved into the stone where no support is structurally needed. Lintels carved above doorways that lead only into further darkness. Curved walls that follow the same trefoil pattern as the temples above ground, but cut into limestone with stone tools by hand, level after level, going down into the earth as if the builders were trying to reach something. By the time the chambers had been fully cleared and recorded by Sir Themistocles Zamet, the Maltese physician and archaeologist who took charge of the work after the initial accidental discovery, the remains of more than 7,000 individuals had been counted. Skulls, long bones, bone fragments mixed with a red ochre, a scale of mortuary use that no one had quite anticipated. The pace of revelation continued. In 1913, again under Zamet's careful direction, the Tarxien temple complex was identified after a farmer reported repeatedly striking large stones with his plough at the edge of his field. Tarxien turned out to be one of the most decorated of all the Maltese temples, spirals carved in low relief on the surfaces of altars, domestic animals depicted in procession on the walls, a colossal statue of a seated figure, broken at the waist, whose lower half alone was over 2 meters in height. The upper half had been lost in antiquity, but the proportions of the lower half implied a complete statue some 4 meters tall. If such proportions were intended to represent a deity at human scale, the figure was without precedent. If they were intended to suggest something else, the question of what they were suggesting did not yet have a respectable answer. By the close of the First World War, more than 30 separate megalithic temple sites had been identified across the small archipelago. By the end of the 20th century, the figure had grown to over 50, with the certainty that more remained undiscovered beneath the soil of cultivated fields. For an island of 316 square kilometres in total area, the density of monumental architecture had no parallel anywhere in the prehistoric world. The question that no excavator was willing to ask in writing, but that every excavator must privately have considered, was this: if so much had been built in so small a place, by so small a population, what did the builders think they were doing? And what had happened in the space of a few centuries around the year 2500 before the Common Era to make them stop? The stones themselves are the first witnesses, and they speak in a language that any geologist can read. Malta is built of limestone. 2 kinds of limestone, more precisely, both laid down on the floor of an ancient sea some 20 to 30 million years ago, lifted slowly into the open air by the same tectonic pressure that shaped the boot of Italy and the toe of Sicily. The softer kind is called globigerina, after the microscopic shells of the foraminifera that compose it. It is the colour of pale honey when freshly cut, the colour of weathered ivory when it has stood for a few centuries in the open air. It is soft enough to be scored with a fingernail when freshly quarried. A patient worker with a stone chisel and a wooden mallet can shape it into almost any form. The harder kind is called coralline, after the fossilized corals it contains. It is grey, dense, and stubborn. It blunts modern steel tools. It resists weathering in a way that globigerina cannot. The builders of the Maltese temples knew the difference between these 2 stones with a precision that has taken modern petrologists careful study to confirm. Coralline was reserved for the outer walls, where it could withstand the rain and the sea wind. Globigerina was reserved for the interior altars and decorated panels, where its softness allowed the spirals and lozenges to be carved with delicacy. The choice was correct. It is still correct, 4,500 years later. The outer walls still stand, the interior carvings still survive. That much is straightforward. The complications begin when one asks how the stones moved. The largest single block at Ġgantija weighs somewhere between 50 and 60 tons. The estimate varies depending on which authority one consults, because no one in modern times has put it on a scale. It rests in the outer wall, set on its lower edge, taller than 2 men, broader than a small house. It was quarried from a source that has been provisionally identified some hundreds of meters distant. It was transported across uneven ground. It was raised into its present position with such precision that the joint between it and the neighbouring block is, in places, fine enough to refuse the passage of a knife blade. The builders, according to the official chronology, did this without the wheel. They did this without draft animals of any significant size. They did this without metal tools harder than the limestone itself, since copper and bronze do not appear in the Maltese archaeological record until after the temples had already been abandoned. They did this with stone hammers, fire, water, and ropes of vegetable fibre, the latter of which has not survived for examination, but which can be reasonably inferred to have existed. How? The honest answer is that no one is entirely sure. Several reconstructions have been offered. The most widely accepted model invokes a method that anthropologists have observed in other pre-industrial societies. Logs were cut and laid as rollers beneath the great stones. The stones were prized onto the rollers using levers of hardwood. Teams of men pulled on ropes secured to the front of the stone, while other teams shifted the rollers from back to front as the load advanced. A few rounded stone balls of appropriate diameter found at Tarxien and at other temple sites have been interpreted as possible ball bearings, intended to serve as rollers in their own right. The model is plausible. It accounts for the movement of stones across level ground at slow but steady speeds. It does not, however, account very well for the movement of stones up the slopes of the Ẓagra plateau, where the gradient is significant and the path narrow, nor does it account, in any quantitatively persuasive way, for the lifting of stones into upper courses, where the height above ground exceeds the reach of any reasonable wooden lever. Some have proposed ramps of earth and rubble, similar in principle to those reconstructed for the building of the Egyptian pyramids a millennium later. The proposal is reasonable in the abstract, but the temples are surrounded by no evidence of such ramps. No deposits of compacted earth nearby, no traces of large-scale earthworks of the appropriate period. If ramps were used, they were cleared away so thoroughly that not a trace remains. Others have suggested that the great stones were tipped into prepared sockets while still horizontal, then levered upright in stages. This is more credible for some of the stones than for others. The very largest blocks, those that form lintels rather than uprights, present the most difficult case. A lintel rests across 2 upright stones. It must be lifted to the height of those uprights and then settled into place from above. There is no easy way to do this with rollers and ropes alone, and yet at Mnajdra and at Tarxien and at Ħaġar Qim, lintels of considerable mass have plainly been so placed. There is a further detail that the more cautious investigators have noted, almost as an aside. The population of the Maltese islands during the Temple period has been estimated, on the basis of settlement evidence and the productive capacity of the limited arable land, at perhaps 10,000 people, perhaps less. A small society. A society whose entire population, if mobilized in its entirety, would have provided perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 adult labourers at any one time. From this small workforce, several thousand tons of stone were quarried, transported and erected across at least 30 separate temple sites over a period of roughly 1,000 years. The arithmetic, when one sits with it for an evening, is uncomfortable. It is not impossible. It is merely difficult to reconcile with the impression that emerges from the temples themselves, which is the impression of a culture for which monumental construction was not an extraordinary effort but a routine activity. The temples do not look like the works of a struggling people stretching itself to the limit. They look like the works of a people for whom this scale of building was somehow ordinary. It is at this point that the older speculations begin to whisper back, as they have done since the early 19th century. The folklore of giants is not, on its surface, a useful contribution to archaeology, but it is the folklore of a people who lived with these stones, who walked past them every day, who knew them as their ancestors had known them, and the folklore says that the stones were too heavy for the people. The folklore says that the work was done by beings of another scale. Even Hugh Newman and the Maltese researcher Anton Mifsud, working independently and from different starting points, have collected and republished older 19th century reports of unusually large skeletal remains found in the temple precincts and in the surrounding fields. These reports are difficult to verify. The bones themselves, when they can be located at all, have been displaced, mislabeled or lost, but the reports exist. They were recorded by witnesses who had no reason to lie, and the question they raise, however awkward, refuses to be entirely silenced. What if the folklore was preserving in its own crude and metaphorical way a memory of the only thing that would make the engineering arithmetic simple? Not giants in the literal sense of mythology, but perhaps a population of greater average stature than the small Mediterranean villagers who would later inherit the islands. Perhaps a tradition of building that drew on knowledge and methods which the inheriting population could no longer reproduce. Perhaps both. The stones, when one stands beside them in the long shadows of the afternoon, do not answer the question. They merely remain where they were placed, in positions that demand an explanation, and that have not yet received one which fully satisfies. There is a shape repeated across the Maltese temples that no one alive today can explain to satisfaction. It is the shape of the floor plan itself. Walk into any of the major sites, Ġgantija, Mnajdra, Ħaġar Qim, Tarxien, Skorba, and the same configuration emerges from the rubble. A long corridor runs from the outer doorway inward. Off the corridor, paired chambers open to the left and the right, curved like the petals of a flower, each one a rough kidney shape lined with upright stones. At the far end of the corridor, often a final chamber closes the axis. The whole resembles, when seen from above, a stylized human figure, a torso, two pairs of limbs, a small head. Or, if the eye prefers a different interpretation, a clover leaf with three rounded lobes set around a central stem. Archaeologists call it the trefoil plan, when there are 3 lobes, or the cloverleaf plan when there are 5. Whatever it is called, it is unique. It exists in this developed form only on Malta. It exists in no neighbouring culture of the period. It exists in no predecessor culture from which it might have descended. It exists in no successor culture into which it might have evolved. It appears on the small archipelago fully formed in the early phase of temple construction. It is replicated with variations of scale and detail across all the principal sites, and then, when the temple culture ends, it disappears so completely that no later building anywhere in the Mediterranean repeats it. This is the difficulty that the patient student of the temples must learn to sit with. Almost every other monumental architecture in the ancient world has antecedents. Egyptian pyramids developed out of mastaba tombs, which developed out of simpler tumuli, which developed out of pit burials. The stepped pyramid of Giza sits on a recognizable evolutionary line. The Mesopotamian ziggurat developed out of the platform temples of the early Sumerian city-states, which developed out of the small mud brick shrines of the Ubaid period. Stonehenge developed out of earlier henges and earlier timber circles, themselves descended from causewayed enclosures and long barrows. Each of these monumental forms can be traced backwards in time through identifiable predecessors, and the predecessors can be traced backwards further still until the eye loses them in the dimness of the Neolithic. The Maltese temple plan has no such pedigree. The earliest phases at Skorba show small huts and simple shrines that bear no formal resemblance to what would shortly follow, and then, with what archaeologists describe as remarkable suddenness, the trefoil plan appears, fully developed, in the building horizon now called Ġgantija phase, dated by radiocarbon to around 3600 before the Common Era. From that moment until the end of the Temple period 1,000 years later, the plan is repeated, refined, elaborated, but never abandoned. What does the plan mean? Several hypotheses have been proposed, none of them entirely convincing, all of them suggestive. The earliest interpreters, working under the influence of late 19th century goddess theories, suggested that the trefoil represented the body of a great mother goddess. The chambers were her womb and her swelling thighs. The corridor was the passage of birth, reversed, leading the worshipper inward into the divine body rather than outward. This reading has the merit of corresponding to the figurines and statues found inside the temples, which depict, with almost obsessive consistency, the same heavy-bodied seated female figure. It has the demerit of being a projection. There is no inscription on any temple wall, no written record from any contemporary culture that confirms the interpretation. Later scholars proposed instead that the trefoil represented a stylized settlement plan, a courtyard with attached huts, monumentalized in stone. This reading has the merit of architectural plausibility. It has the demerit of explaining nothing about why a settlement should have been monumentalized in the first place, nor why the form should have been so faithfully replicated across so many independent sites. A more recent suggestion, advanced quietly by a few researchers working at the edges of the discipline, is that the plan may not have been chosen for its symbolic meaning at all. It may have been chosen for its acoustic properties. The curved walls of the chambers, the carefully calculated proportions of the lobes, the placement of the final chamber at the focal point of the curve, all produce, when measured with modern equipment, sound behaviours that no merely decorative architecture would produce by accident. Standing waves form at specific frequencies. Voices in the inner chambers are heard with unusual clarity at the outer doorway, while voices at the doorway are muffled when they reach the inner chambers. The geometry filters certain ranges of sound and amplifies others. This is a topic that will return in greater detail when the Hypogeum and its underground chambers are considered. For now, it's enough to note that the trefoil plan, whatever its symbolic significance, behaves as if it had been designed by people who understood how sound moves through curved limestone enclosures, and who valued that movement enough to repeat it precisely from one site to the next. Where, then, did this design come from? The honest answer, set down by even the most conservative summaries of Maltese archaeology, is that no one knows. It has no parents, it has no cousins. It arrives on the island with no apparent prelude and departs from history with no apparent issue. There is a phrase that archaeologists sometimes use, almost reluctantly, when they encounter a phenomenon of this shape. They call it a typological singleton, a form that appears once in one place and is never seen again. The Maltese temple plan is the largest, oldest, and most thoroughly elaborated typological singleton in the prehistoric architectural record of the world. It is as if, on a small island in the middle Mediterranean, a complete and sophisticated architectural language emerged from silence, was spoken fluently for 1,000 years, and then fell silent again, without ever being heard outside the islands where it was first uttered. There are those who find this pattern impossible to accept on its own terms. They argue, sometimes plausibly, that the temple plan must have descended from some earlier tradition, whose remains have not yet been found, perhaps because they lie beneath the sea. The Maltese islands during the early Holocene period, when sea levels were significantly lower, were larger than they are today, and may have been connected by land bridges to Sicily, and to the African coast. Any architectural tradition that predated the temples, and that was practiced in low-lying coastal regions now submerged, would lie beyond the reach of conventional excavation. The argument is not foolish. It is, in fact, the only argument that explains the sudden appearance of the trefoil plan without requiring either independent invention from nothing or instruction from a source unknown. But the argument carries with it a corollary that few of its proponents pursue openly. If the architectural tradition descended from a submerged predecessor, then somewhere beneath the waves around the Maltese archipelago lies the evidence of an earlier, possibly larger, possibly older culture, whose existence would rewrite a chapter of human prehistory that most accounts prefer to leave undisturbed. The trefoil plan in that case is not a singleton. It is the visible tip of something that did not survive the rising water, and so the patient eye returns to the floor plan itself, and traces with a slow finger the curve of one lobe, the curve of the next, the placement of the central altar at the heart of the form. It is a beautiful design. It is a precise design. It is a design that knew exactly what it was for, even if no one alive can now say what that was. On the southern shore of the main island, where the cliffs fall toward the sea in a long sweep of pale stone, the temple of Mnajdra stands in a shallow hollow facing the rising sun. The position is not casual. It was chosen, and chosen carefully, by builders who understood something about the sun and the year that most modern people, with their wristwatches and their electric calendars, have forgotten how to perceive. Twice each year, on the mornings of the spring and autumn equinoxes, when the day and the night divide themselves into equal halves and the sun rises due east on the geometric horizon, a beam of light enters the outer doorway of the southern temple at Mnajdra. It passes the length of the entrance corridor. It strikes the central altar at the far end of the axis, and the strike is not approximate. It is exact. The light falls on a precise edge of the carved stone, an edge that has been positioned so that for those few minutes, twice a year, the architecture and the cosmos are aligned in a single uninterrupted line. The first investigators of the temple in the 19th century did not notice this. They mapped the walls, they recorded the dimensions, they drew the carvings. They did not stay through the night and watch what happened at dawn. The alignment was identified properly only in the middle decades of the 20th century, when the question of archaeastronomy began to be taken seriously by a small number of researchers willing to consider that prehistoric architects might have known more about the heavens than the cultures that succeeded them. Once the equinoctial alignment at Mnajdra had been recognized, further observations followed. At the winter solstice, when the sun rises at its southernmost point on the horizon, a slice of light enters a different opening in the temple and illuminates a different upright stone. At the summer solstice, when the sun rises at its northernmost point, the same is true in a third configuration. The temple, taken as a whole, is not merely a building. It is an instrument for the marking of the year, an instrument so precisely calibrated that, after nearly 6,000 years of weathering, earthquake and human disturbance, it still works. The precision is the part that resists comfortable explanation. To align a building with the cardinal directions to within a degree or two is not, in itself, difficult. A reasonably patient observer with a vertical post and a smooth piece of ground can determine true east by watching the shadow of the post at sunrise and sunset across several months. Such methods were within the reach of any settled Neolithic community. But to align a building so that the rising sun, on the precise mornings of the equinoxes, casts a beam of light that strikes a specific carved feature at the far end of an interior corridor, that requires something more. It requires not only an understanding of the cardinal points, but an understanding of the angular geometry of the rising sun at different declinations, the projection of those declinations onto a sloping horizon, and the correction for the height of the doorway, the depth of the corridor, and the precise inclination of the surrounding terrain. The temple is in effect a solid model of an astronomical observation, frozen in stone. It encodes a quantity of practical mathematics that the academic tradition does not, on its standard chronology, expect to find in the central Mediterranean in the middle of the 4th millennium before the Common Era. Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain in southern England would not be aligned with comparable precision to the solstitial sunrise for another 1,000 years. The mathematical methods that allowed the Egyptians to orient their pyramids to true north were not developed, so far as the surviving record can show, until perhaps the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The temple at Mnajdra precedes both. It precedes them by a margin so wide that the question of who taught the Maltese builders, or from whom they inherited their knowledge, cannot be answered by any straightforward chain of cultural transmission. They appear to have known, on a small Mediterranean island, what no neighbouring culture of the period is known to have known. There is a further detail in the alignment that the older guidebooks do not mention. The light beam at the equinox does not strike a single stone alone. As the sun rises over the course of a few minutes, the beam moves along the back wall of the inner chamber, illuminating different upright stones in sequence. To an observer standing in the corridor, the temple appears to be lit not all at once, but in stages, as if the architecture were performing the rising of the day in slow motion. The effect would have been theatrical for anyone permitted to witness it. It is unknown how many would have been so permitted. The temples are small. The inner chambers could not have held more than a few dozen people. Whatever was happening at the equinoctial dawn, it was not happening for the masses. It was happening for someone, some small group, some priesthood perhaps, some inner circle of observers who alone were permitted to stand in the corridor and watch the year turn. The question of who they were and what they thought they were doing remains open. Some researchers, working in the tradition of comparative religion, have noted that equinoctial observations are associated in many later cultures with cycles of birth, death, and renewal. The equinox is the moment of balance, of equal light and dark, the hinge on which the year swings. To build a temple that captures this moment in its architecture is to make a statement about the relationship between the human community and the cycles of the cosmos. The statement in this reading would not have been principally astronomical. It would have been religious. The astronomy was the instrument. The religion was the purpose. This is a reasonable hypothesis. It does not exhaust the possibilities. Other researchers have noted that an equinoctial alignment, sustained across centuries, also serves a practical purpose. It allows the keeping of an accurate calendar. It allows the prediction of seasons, the timing of agricultural decisions, the management of long voyages and trade contacts. A society that knew when the equinoxes fell, and that could record this knowledge in a permanent structure, possessed an advantage over neighbouring societies that did not. There is one further question that, in the quiet of an attentive evening, refuses to remain entirely silent. The alignment at Mnajdra, while precise today, has shifted slightly from what it would have been at the date of original construction. The Earth's axial tilt undergoes a slow oscillation, a precession that alters the angles at which the sun rises on different points of the horizon over periods measured in tens of thousands of years. The current alignment at Mnajdra is good. The alignment at the date of construction, around 3600 before the Common Era, would have been almost perfect. Some researchers, extrapolating the geometry backwards, have suggested that the alignment would have been even more perfect at a date significantly earlier than the conventional dating of the temple. The suggestion, in their hands, becomes the basis of an argument that the temple itself, or some structure on the same site that preceded the visible temple, may be older than the radiocarbon dates of the associated pottery and bone suggest. The argument is not without difficulty. it is also not without its quiet force. The stones, as the patient observer learns, are not always willing to confess their age in the simple language of the artifacts that surround them. A short walk uphill from Mnajdra on a windswept ridge overlooking the same southern coastline, the temple of Ħaġar Qim rises out of the rough-cast country in a confusion of stone. The name in Maltese means standing stones, and the description is literal. Many of the great uprights here stand exposed to the sky, weathered by 5,500 summers of African wind and Mediterranean salt, their surfaces pitted and silvered by the long erosion of time. Of all the Maltese temples, Ħaġar Qim is perhaps the most photographed, in part because so much of it has remained above ground from the beginning. The visitor can stand among the megaliths in the open air, in a way that is no longer possible at Tarxien, where modern protective coverings have enclosed the site. At Ħaġar Qim the sun still falls on the carved spirals, as it did when the spirals were freshly chiselled. The wind still moves through the temple's chambers, as it did when those chambers were freshly raised. It was at Ħaġar Qim and at the related sites nearby that the most distinctive class of small finds from the temple culture came out of the ground. They were figurines, small statues, modest in size, almost domestic in their scale. They portrayed, with monotonous and almost insistent consistency, a single subject. A seated female figure, hugely fat, her thighs swelling outward, her arms folded across her breast or resting on her belly, her head usually small and crudely indicated. Some of the figurines are no larger than a child's hand. Others are substantial, weighing many kilograms, requiring 2 arms to lift. The largest of them, found broken at Tarxien and reconstructed only in its lower portion, would have stood, when complete, perhaps 2.5 meters tall. They are not idealized figures. They are not the slender goddesses of later Mediterranean art. They are figures of extreme corpulence, sometimes described as obese, sometimes described, more carefully, as figures whose creators wish to emphasize the bodily abundance of a particular kind of feminine presence. Many of them have been found in clusters, set near altars, or set in niches that appear to have been designed for their display. What were they? The early interpreters, looking at them through the lens of 19th century scholarship, called them mother goddesses and left the matter there. The mid-20th century, under the influence of figures such as Maria Gimbutas, the Lithuanian-American archaeologist who spent much of her career arguing for the existence of a Neolithic religion, centred on a great mother goddess across old Europe and the Mediterranean, gave the matter a more elaborate name. The Maltese figurines, in her hands, became evidence for a widespread goddess culture that had once flourished from the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the Aegean, before being replaced by the patriarchal religions of the Bronze Age. Gimbutas was not a fringe figure. She held a professorship at the University of California, Los Angeles. She published with the most respectable academic presses, and yet her central thesis, that the figurines of Neolithic Europe and the central Mediterranean represented the worship of a single great goddess, associated with fertility, birth, death, and regeneration, has remained controversial throughout the half-century since she first set it out. Some archaeologists treat it as a useful interpretive framework. Others treat it as a projection of modern desires onto silent material. The Maltese figurines in this dispute occupy a particularly difficult position. They are too numerous, too consistent in their subject matter, and too clearly placed in ritual context to be dismissed. They are also, in the absence of any contemporary written record, unable to confirm or deny any specific theology that may be projected upon them. There is one figurine, however, that escapes the controversy by the simple expedient of doing something different from all the others. It was found not at Ħaġar Qim, but at the Hypogeum, in the underground necropolis at Ħal Saflieni, in a chamber on the second level. It is small, no larger than a fist. It depicts a woman lying on her side on a low couch, her head propped on one folded arm, her hips curving softly downward into the cushion. Her eyes are closed. She is asleep. She has been called, since the moment of her discovery in the early years of the 20th century, the Sleeping Lady of Malta. She's unlike any other figurine from the temple culture. The others are seated, standing, or symbolically configured. She alone is at rest. She alone has a face whose features are rendered with what can only be called tenderness. She alone gives the impression of having been modelled from life, or modelled at least from the remembered observation of a particular sleeping body, by someone who had stood and watched that body sleep. She was found in a place where the dead were placed, 7,000 of them eventually in the chambers of the Hypogeum. Whatever she represented, she was not separate from the question of death. She lay among the bones. She slept while they kept their long silence. Some interpreters have read her as a representation of the dead themselves, sleeping in the underworld, awaiting some form of awakening. Others have read her as a representation of a goddess of dreams, or of incubation, or of the trance state into which priests and supplicants may have entered during the rituals practiced in the underground chambers. The early excavator Themistocles Zammit, in his published reports, used the careful word divinity, without committing himself to a particular reading. He had seen too many strange things in those chambers, and he was unwilling to attach a name to what he could not explain. The visitor who stands today before the small replica of the Sleeping Lady in the National Museum of Archaeology in Valletta, the original is kept in protected storage, can understand the reticence. The figurine does not look like a deity in any conventional sense. It looks like a woman one knew, who has lain down and who has fallen quietly asleep. The combination of evidence at Ħaġar Qim and at the related sites, the fat-seated figures, the sleeping lady, the spirals, the curvilinear plan of the temples themselves, has led several generations of researchers to conclude that the religion practiced in these structures was centered, in some fundamental way, on the female body, on its capacity to bring life, to nourish life, to receive the dead back into itself at the end. Whether one calls this a goddess religion or a fertility religion or a religion of the cycles, the constellation of imagery is consistent. And then, around the year 2500 before the Common Era, the imagery stops. The figurines stop being made. The temples stop being built. The seated goddesses and the sleeping woman vanish from the archaeological record of the Maltese islands, and they do not return. The Bronze Age people who later occupied the islands left figurines of their own, but they're different. They are male. They are warriors. They are armed. The world that had held the small soft bodies in its quiet hands had become a different world. What had happened in the interval, in those few generations of silence between the last spiral and the first sword, is a question that the islands themselves do not appear to wish to answer. To descend into the Hypogeum at Ħal Saflieni is to enter a structure that no surface description prepares the mind to receive. The visitor is admitted only in small groups, only by advance reservation, only after passing through climate-controlled vestibules designed to protect the painted walls from the carbon dioxide of human breath. The Maltese authorities limit the daily admissions to a small number, and the rooms beyond the entrance hall are dimly lit by carefully positioned electric lamps that do not disturb the original surfaces. When the modern intrusion of light and air conditioning is set aside, what remains is a sequence of chambers carved downward into the soft Globigerina limestone of the central island, 3 levels deep, descending into the earth to a depth of more than 10 meters below the modern surface. The lowest chamber lies in such darkness that the original visitors, whoever they were, must have descended through it carrying lamps of small flame, perhaps oil, perhaps tallow, perhaps something else for which no residue has survived. The walls of the deepest level still bear the soot of these ancient lamps, smudged in patterns that follow the natural drift of the air. The chambers are not natural caves. They are sculpted. They were cut from the living rock with stone tools, level by level, room by room, over a span of generations that radiocarbon dating has placed between approximately 3,600 and 2,500 before the Common Era. The same period, almost precisely as the construction of the surface temples. The Hypogeum is not separate from the temple tradition. It is the temple tradition turned inside out, performed in negative, hollowed downward into the earth instead of raised upward into the sky. The architectural vocabulary is identical: trefoil chambers, apsidal recesses, pillared doorways, carved lintels above thresholds. But here the lintels are not blocks of stone set in place by hand. They are columns of original rock left uncut by the chisel, while everything around them was patiently removed. The chambers were made by subtraction, not by construction. The negative of a temple, the mould from which the temple above ground could have been cast. The work required to do this is difficult to imagine for the modern observer who has not stood in the chambers and run a hand along the walls. The Globiurina limestone is soft when first quarried, but it is not soft enough to be cut quickly. With stone tools alone, the rate of removal is measured in handfuls per hour, not in barrow loads per day. The Hypogeum, taken as a whole, represents the removal of many hundreds of cubic meters of stone from the heart of the bedrock. The displaced material had to be carried out somehow, lifted up the shafts to the open air, and disposed of in deposits that have never been clearly identified. The labour involved was extraordinary. The labour was sustained for 1,000 years, and throughout that millennium what was happening in the chambers below was not primarily the carving of new architecture. It was the receiving of the dead. When Sir Themistocles Zammit cleared the chambers in the years after the accidental discovery of 1902, the floors of the lower levels were found to be covered in human bone. Skulls, long bones, fragments of every part of the human skeleton, mixed with red ochre and broken pottery, and the small bone amulets that the Maltese temple culture had used as personal ornaments. The bones were not articulated. They were not, in most cases, laid out in the ordered burials that characterize other Neolithic cemeteries of the Eastern Mediterranean. They had been placed in the chambers after the bodies had already passed through the first stage of decomposition. The flesh had been allowed to depart, perhaps in another location, perhaps in the upper chambers of the Hypogeum itself, and only the bones had been brought down into the lower rooms. The custom is what anthropologists call secondary burial. It is known from many cultures of the prehistoric world. What is unusual at the Hypogeum is the scale. Zammit and his successors estimated, on the basis of the bone fragments recovered and the chambers explored, that the remains of approximately 7,000 individuals had been placed in the Hypogeum across the centuries of its use. 7,000! For a population that may never have exceeded 10,000 living people at any one time, the number is significant. The Hypogeum was not a tomb for the elite. It was not the burial place of a single dynasty or priesthood. It was, by the arithmetic of its bones, a major receptacle for the dead of the whole island society, sustained over so many generations that almost every family on Malta, across 30 or 40 generations of human life, must eventually have surrendered at least one of its own to the chambers below the surface. And then there are the spirals. On the ceiling of one of the chambers on the second level, the chamber sometimes called the main chamber, sometimes called the hall, the natural surface of the cut limestone has been painted in patterns of red ochre. The pigment has survived because the chamber was sealed for so long, and because the modern protective regime has kept it sealed even now. The spirals are large. They cover broad areas of the ceiling. They are not isolated marks, but a continuous pattern, swirling and interlocking, reminiscent of the surface decorations found at Newgrange in Ireland, or at the temple complex of Tarxien on Malta itself. Red ochre is, In many prehistoric cultures, the pigment of blood, of life, of the womb, of the act of birth. Its use in a mortuary context is not unique to Malta, but the scale of its use at the Hypogeum, painted across the ceilings of chambers that contain the bones of thousands of the dead, is striking. The dead lay beneath the spirals. The spirals, perhaps, were what their living kin wished them to see if their closed eyes were ever to open again. The deepest level contains a small chamber that the early excavators named, with a phrase borrowed from the architecture of Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies. It is the most perfectly finished space in the entire complex. Its walls are dressed smooth, its floor is level, its ceiling, low above the head of a standing adult, is cut into an imitation of a corbelled stone roof, although there is no structural reason for a corbel in a chamber excavated downward from solid rock. The imitation is purely visual. The chamber was made to look as though it were a small underground temple of the surface kind, faithfully reproduced in the earth. Why? The honest answer is that no one knows. The room is too small to have held more than a handful of celebrants. It contains no carved altar, no bench, no obvious place for offerings. It is finished with a precision that suggests it was important, and it lies at the deepest point of the entire complex, at the place to which all the descending corridors finally lead. Whatever was meant to happen there, it was meant to happen at the bottom of everything, at the end of the descent, in the place where the spirals on the ceilings of the upper rooms could no longer be seen. There is one further chamber in the Hypogeum that has, in recent decades, attracted attention of a different kind. It lies on the second level, not far from the chamber of the painted spirals. It is small, roughly oval in plan, with a low ceiling and walls cut smooth from the surrounding limestone. Set into one of its walls, at the height of a standing adult's head, is a niche carved horizontally into the rock, like the open mouth of a stone fish. The early excavators called the niche the oracle hole. The name was not arbitrary, they had noticed something. A voice spoken into the niche behaved strangely. It did not simply echo. It returned to the listener altered. It seemed to fill the surrounding space with a sound larger and deeper than the original voice had produced. Visitors to the chamber in the early years of the 20th century were sometimes invited to demonstrate the effect. A whispered phrase projected into the niche came back as a rumble that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. Zammit and his colleagues recorded the phenomenon and moved on. They had bones to catalogue, pottery to register, painted ceilings to protect. The acoustic curiosity of one small chamber was for them an interesting detail rather than a problem to be solved. It would take nearly a century before researchers with the appropriate equipment began to study the chamber systematically. When they did, what they found troubled the easy assumption that the effect was accidental. A team of acoustic engineers and archaeoacousticians working in the early years of the 21st century measured the resonant frequencies of the oracle chamber and of several other chambers within the Hypogeum. The principal resonance, the frequency at which the walls of the oracle chamber sustained sound most powerfully, was approximately 110 Hz. Low frequency, the frequency of a deep human male voice in chant, the frequency of the lowest register of a Tibetan monk in throat song, the frequency at which the walls of certain stone megalithic chambers elsewhere in Europe have also been measured to resonate, including chambers within the Great Mound at Newgrange in Ireland and the burial chamber at Wayland's Smithy in England. The coincidence is striking. 110 Hz is not a frequency that emerges by accident from the geometry of arbitrary stone enclosures. It is, on the contrary, a frequency that has to be designed for. The chamber dimensions, the curvature of the walls, the height of the ceiling, the proportions of the niche, all conspire to produce a standing wave at this specific frequency. Anything else would have required different proportions. The proportions that exist were the proportions chosen. The Italian researcher Paolo De Bertolis, working at the University of Trieste, has conducted some of the most systematic investigations of this resonance and has published his findings in peer-reviewed acoustic journals. His measurements confirm that the 110 Hz resonance is consistent across multiple sessions and is not an artifact of any single equipment configuration. Independent work by the American researcher Glenn Kreisberg and others has confirmed the figure. The American physician Dr. Ian Cook, working in a different research context at the University of California, Los Angeles, conducted a study in 2008 in which volunteers were exposed to sound at 110 Hz while undergoing functional brain imaging. The results were unexpected. Activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain associated with rational planning, language and decision-making, was measurably reduced during the exposure. Activity in regions associated with mood, intuition, and what Cook described as creative thought patterns was measurably increased. The brain, in other words, shifted its mode of operation in response to the specific frequency. Whether this shift was significant enough to matter in any practical sense for the original users of the hypogeum is a question the study did not pursue. But the suggestion was raised, and it has not been quietly retired. The implication, if one is willing to follow the trail at least a little way, is uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable because it requires the conclusion that the builders of the Hypogeum, working 4,500 years before the development of modern acoustic science, were either spectacularly lucky or were operating on a tradition of practical knowledge about the effects of sound on the human nervous system that no formal archaeology has previously acknowledged. The tradition would not have been written. The Maltese temple builders left no inscriptions, no texts, no diagrams. The tradition would have been preserved orally, transmitted from one generation of priests or architects to the next, by practice rather than by theory. It would have been a craft of knowing what proportions to give to a chamber, so that the chamber, when entered, would change something in the person who entered it. What were they trying to do? The honest reply is that no one can say with confidence. But the configuration of the Hypogeum offers some quiet suggestions. The lowest level contains the deepest darkness. The oracle chamber lies on the route of descent, in a position where a celebrant would have passed it on the way down. The acoustic effect, sustained by chant or by a low droning voice, would have filled the air of the surrounding chambers, including the chamber of the painted spirals and the chambers of the dead. A person descending through these spaces by lamplight, hearing such a sound rise up from the walls themselves, undergoing the physiological shift that 110 Hz produces in the human brain, would have experienced something that no ordinary daily life could have prepared them for. They would have entered a state of consciousness different from the state in which they had begun. They would have felt, perhaps, that they had crossed a threshold of more than stone. And when they emerged again into the daylight of the surface, they would have carried with them, however briefly, the memory of a state to which only the Hypogeum had given them access. The hypothesis is speculative. It cannot be confirmed without testimony from the celebrants themselves, and that testimony will not come. The bones in the lower chambers do not speak. But the hypothesis has the advantage of accounting for the otherwise puzzling combination of features at the site. The investment of labour in carving chambers of specific proportions out of the bedrock, the application of red ochre across the ceilings, the concentration of human remains in the lower levels, the careful finishing of the deepest chamber, the so-called Holy of Holies, at the bottom of the entire complex. None of these features make easy sense as the work of a culture that was merely disposing of its dead. They make a different and more troubling sense as the work of a culture that was, in some practical and methodical way, attempting to do something to the consciousness of the living who descended into the chambers, and perhaps also to the consciousness of the dead who lay there, beneath the spirals listening to the rumble of the chant. The temples above ground had aligned themselves with the rising of the sun. The chambers below ground had aligned themselves with the rising of a frequency. Both alignments are precise. Both alignments imply a knowledge that the simple chronology of human prehistory has not previously been willing to grant the people who designed them. And in both cases the question remains, how did they know? There is a part of the Hypogeum story that does not appear in the standard guidebooks. It surfaces, when it surfaces at all, in the marginal literature of independent researchers, in the careful footnotes of a few Maltese physicians who took an interest in the question, in the yellowed pages of the early 20th century newspaper accounts that have been quietly forgotten by the institutions whose archives still hold them. The story concerns the skulls, not all 7,000 of them, only a small subset. A subset that, by various reports, exhibited a feature that the official record now finds it difficult to acknowledge. They were elongated, not in the ordinary manner of the long-headed populations that anthropologists call dolichocephalic, which is a normal human variation found across many groups and many periods. Elongated to a degree that exceeded normal variation, elongated in a manner that, in some specimens, suggested either an unusual congenital condition or, more controversially, the result of deliberate cranial deformation, or, in the strongest accounts, something that did not quite fit either of those explanations. The reports begin with Themistocles Zammit himself. In his catalogue of materials recovered from the Hypogeum during the early phase of excavation, published in the first decade of the 20th century, he noted that certain skulls displayed a marked elongation of the parietal region and an unusual posterior projection. He did not theorize about it. He recorded it. He had been trained as a physician before he turned to archaeology, and he was a careful describer of pathological and anatomical anomalies. Photographs were taken. Some of them survive in the archives of the Maltese National Museum. They show, with the dispassionate clarity of early scientific photography, crania whose proportions invite a longer look than the casual visitor to a museum is likely to give them. The skulls were displayed for some years, in the early decades of the 20th century, in a glass case at the small archaeological museum that preceded the present National Museum of Archaeology in Valletta. Visitors of the period left brief written impressions. A few of those impressions were noted in tourist accounts. A few of those tourist accounts have been preserved. Then, sometime in the years following the Second World War, the skulls were removed from public display. The official record indicates that they were transferred to research collections for further study. The unofficial record, traced patiently by the Maltese physician and researcher Dr. Anton Mifsud and his colleagues during the closing decades of the 20th century, indicates something less straightforward. When Mifsud requested access to the elongated specimens for medical examination, he was told that the skulls were no longer available. They had been lost in transit. They had been deaccessioned. They had been incorporated into general study collections from which they could not now be identified. The accounts varied depending on whom Mifsud asked. The pattern of the variations did not inspire confidence. Mifsud, working with his son Charles Mifsud, with the engineer Chris Agius Sultana, and with the antiquarian researcher Hugh Newman in later years, published a series of small volumes in which the disappearance of the skulls was set out as a matter of public concern. The volumes did not receive wide academic attention. They circulated in the underground network of alternative archaeology. They were dismissed by the institutional gatekeepers as the work of enthusiasts, and the skulls themselves, by the second decade of the 21st century, had still not been produced for independent examination. What is to be made of all this? The honest investigator must hold several possibilities in suspension at once. The first possibility is that the early reports were simply mistaken, that the elongation noted in the early catalogues was within normal anatomical variation, exaggerated by inexperienced observers, and that the skulls themselves were perfectly ordinary specimens that had been preserved in the general collections without controversy. This is the position implicit in the official Maltese archaeological literature. it is a defensible position. Reports of unusual skulls in early excavations have, on more than one occasion, turned out to be reports of unusual perspectives, photographic distortions, or specimens of normal variation viewed without comparative context. The phenomenon is well known. The second possibility is that the skulls were anomalous but explicable, and that the institutional embarrassment of having displayed them as oddities during a more credulous age has led to a quiet withdrawal of them from public view. This is also defensible. Museums adjust their displays. Older interpretations are replaced by newer ones. Specimens that no longer support the current scholarly consensus are sometimes removed from gallery to storage, where they remain accessible in principle but no longer prominent in fact. The third possibility, and the one that the alternative literature has pressed with increasing insistence, is that the skulls represented something more genuinely strange, something that, if openly acknowledged and properly investigated, would require the rewriting of certain assumptions about the population that built the Hypogeum and the Maltese temples. Cranial elongation of the kind described in the early reports is associated, in the broader archaeological record, with two phenomena. The first is intentional cranial modification, practiced in several cultures of the ancient world by binding the heads of infants to produce a desired adult shape. This practice was widespread in the Andean cultures of South America. It was practiced, at least sporadically, in the Hunnican steppe cultures of the late antiquity. It produced characteristic patterns that the trained anatomist can recognize. The second is a rare congenital condition, of which several variants are known in modern clinical practice, that produces elongation without external manipulation. Neither phenomenon, however, would account for the secrecy that has surrounded the Maltese specimens. Intentional modification is a known practice. Congenital elongation is a known pathology. Both could be acknowledged without scandal. The reluctance to acknowledge the Maltese skulls, in the form preserved by the early reports, suggests at minimum an institutional unease that goes beyond ordinary scholarly caution. The fourth possibility, the one whispered in the speculative literature, is that the elongation reflected neither intentional modification nor known pathology, but the natural morphology of some part of the population that built and used the Hypogeum, a population of distinct origin, a population whose physical characteristics, if confirmed, would force the question of where they came from and where they went. This is the possibility that the alternative researchers have pursued, and it is the possibility that the official record has neither confirmed nor decisively refuted. The skulls have not been produced. The matter is not closed. It has simply been allowed to drift to the margins, where it cannot be examined and from which it cannot quite be erased. A patient observer, weighing the four possibilities, will find that the second and the third are the most likely, with some weight remaining for the fourth, as a question rather than as a claim. The reasonable conclusion is not that ancient Malta was inhabited by a race of long-skulled non-humans. The reasonable conclusion is simply that something was found, something was reported, something was photographed, and something was then withdrawn from independent examination in a manner that does not match the ordinary handling of archaeological materials. The folklore had said the temples were built by giants, the bones had been brought up out of the chambers, and the bones, for reasons that no responsible institution has yet been willing to explain in full, had then been moved into a darkness from which they have not since returned. Around the year 2500 before the Common Era, the Maltese temple culture ended. The phrasing is mild. The phrasing conceals what was, on the evidence of the ground itself, one of the most peculiar collapses in the entire prehistoric record of the Mediterranean. There is no burnt layer to mark a violent end, no mass grave of slaughtered villagers, no abrupt change in the pottery sequence to indicate a sudden invasion that displaced one population with another. The temples were not destroyed. They were abandoned, The figurines were not smashed, they were simply no longer made. The hypogeum was not desecrated. It was sealed, perhaps with intention, perhaps merely by neglect, and the dead within it were left to their long silence. The culture that had built the largest and oldest temple complex in Mediterranean prehistory, that had carved chambers downward into the bedrock to a depth of 3 stories, that had aligned its architecture to the equinoctial sunrise with a precision that even Stonehenge would not match for another 1,000 years, ceased to exist. And the silence it left behind on the islands persisted for several generations before any new culture was visible in the soil. The Bronze Age people who eventually appeared in the archaeological record of the Maltese islands were not the descendants of the temple builders. Their pottery was different, their settlement patterns were different, their burial customs were different. They came, by the analysis of their material culture, from elsewhere, probably from Sicily or from the broader region of the central Mediterranean. They brought with them the use of bronze, the cultivation of new crops, the social organisation of a warrior society. They camped within the ruins of the temples. They sometimes used the great fallen stones as foundations for their own modest huts. They left their pots and their bones mingled with the older materials in a stratigraphic layer that the careful excavator can still separate from what lay beneath. They did not, so far as can be told from any surviving evidence, attempt to rebuild what had stood before them. They did not record the older buildings as having any particular significance. They simply lived among the ruins, used what was useful, and let the rest sink slowly into the soil. What had happened in the interval between the last temple builder and the first Bronze Age camper? The interval was not long. By the most generous estimates, it lasted no more than a few hundred years. By the more conservative estimates, it may have been as short as a century. In that brief span of generations, an entire culture had ceased to exist, and the manner of its ceasing has been the subject of careful and inconclusive debate for as long as archaeologists have been willing to discuss the matter at all. Several hypotheses have been proposed. Each one explains some of the evidence. None of them explains all of it. The first hypothesis is climatic. Around the middle of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, climate proxies from across the Mediterranean basin record a period of unusual aridity. Tree ring sequences from the broader region show stress in the same window. Lake sediment cores from sites as distant as the Levant and North Africa record reduced rainfall, intensified summer drought, and the contraction of the wetter zones that had supported settled agriculture for the preceding 2,000 years. The phenomenon is sometimes called the 4.2 kiloyear event, after its approximate date of onset measured backward from the present. It has been invoked to explain the collapse of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, the contraction of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, the disruption of urban life in the Indus Valley. It is at least plausible, the hypothesis runs, that the same event placed an unsustainable burden on the small population of the Maltese archipelago, exhausted the limited agricultural capacity of the islands, and forced the survivors to abandon both the temples and the social organisation that had supported them. This is a respectable hypothesis. It accounts for the timing. It accounts for the absence of a violent end. It does not, however, fully account for the totality of the cultural disappearance. Other societies stressed by the same climatic event reduced their populations, contracted their settlements, and survived in altered form. The Maltese temple culture did not contract. It vanished. The second hypothesis is epidemic. A pathogen of some kind, introduced perhaps through coastal trade contacts with the wider Mediterranean, may have swept through a small island population with no prior immunity, and produced a mortality rate sufficient to make further temple construction and ritual continuity impossible. The hypothesis has the merit of accounting for the absence of any sign of violence. A society reduced by disease leaves no mass graves of warriors. It simply contracts, and its specialized activities cease. The hypothesis has the demerit of leaving no positive evidence in the soil. No epidemic-scale burial deposits have been identified from the appropriate horizon. The Hypogeum bones, examined for pathological markers, show no consistent pattern of acute disease. The hypothesis is possible but unconfirmed. The third hypothesis is internal. The temple culture may have collapsed under the weight of its own demands. The sustained investment of labour in monumental construction, in the carving of underground chambers, in the maintenance of a priestly class supported by the produce of a limited population, may have reached a point at which the system could no longer sustain itself. Smaller and less ambitious successor cultures have left their traces in many parts of the prehistoric world. The Maltese case in this reading would be a particularly stark example of social overreach. The temples grew too large for the society that built them. When the society could no longer feed both its priests and its farmers in adequate measure, it discarded the priests, and the religion that the priests had served disappeared with them. The fourth hypothesis, raised most insistently by the small school of researchers willing to consider the possibility, is geological. The Maltese archipelago lies in a tectonically active region of the central Mediterranean. The southern coast of the main island, where the temples of Mnajdra and Ħaġar Qim stand, falls in a series of cliffs that show evidence of past landslides and seismic disruption. Submarine surveys conducted from the late 20th century onward have identified, in the waters off the Maltese coast, traces of submerged shoreline features that lie at depths consistent with sea level rise during the Holocene. It is at least conceivable that a catastrophic event, whether a major earthquake, a tsunami originating from the Sicilian seismic zone, or a sudden geomorphological collapse of part of the coastline, may have contributed to the end of the temple culture. The hypothesis is difficult to test. It would not be invisible in the archaeological record. Some traces would be expected. The traces have not been clearly identified, although the search for them has not been exhaustive. A fifth possibility, less often discussed, combines elements of all four. A drying climate weakens the agricultural base. A reduced population can no longer maintain the temples or the priesthood. A disease or a natural disaster delivers a final blow to a society already compromised. The combination, rather than any single cause, brings the culture to an end. This is the soft and reasonable answer. It is also the answer that admits, more honestly than any single hypothesis, the limits of present understanding. The temple builders are gone, the temples remain. The interval between the two is filled with silence, and the silence, however many hypotheses are placed upon it, has not yet spoken. There is a name that hovers around the Maltese question whenever the conversation runs late and the participants grow honest with each other. The name was first written down by a Greek philosopher in the 4th century before the Common Era. In two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, the philosopher was Plato, the name was Atlantis. He set it down with the conviction of a man recording a tradition received from older sources, by his account through the Athenian statesman Solon, who in turn had received it from priests at the Egyptian temple of Sais. The tradition described a great island civilization, situated beyond the Pillars of Heracles, whose seafaring people had ruled a wide dominion in remote antiquity, and which had been destroyed in a single day and a single night by violent earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the sea so completely that no surface trace remained. Plato's account, taken at face value, has occupied the imagination of every subsequent age. It has produced libraries of speculation, expeditions to every quarter of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and a steady output of books arguing variously that Atlantis lay in the Azores, in the Caribbean, off the coast of Spain, in the Aegean, in Antarctica, or in the depths of any other body of water large enough to swallow a sufficiently grand hypothesis. The Maltese case in the broader debate has not been a popular candidate. The Pillars of Heracles in Plato's account were identified by the Greeks with the Strait of Gibraltar, which would place Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean to the west, not in the central Mediterranean. The geography seems to rule Malta out, and the dating that Plato provides, which would place the destruction of Atlantis some 9,000 years before Solon, would push the event back to a time roughly contemporary with Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia, far earlier than the conventional dating of the Maltese temples. On both counts, the conventional reading of Plato seems to discourage the Maltese hypothesis, and yet a small but persistent group of researchers, working principally on Malta itself, has pursued the connection for several decades. The most articulate of them was the Maltese antiquarian and historian Joseph Ellul, who in the late 20th century published a series of works arguing that the strait between Malta and Sicily, now wholly submerged, had once been a land bridge, and that the Maltese archipelago had once been part of a larger landmass which had been broken apart and partly drowned by a catastrophic event in the geological recent past. Ellul drew on the marine bathymetric surveys of the central Mediterranean that had become available in his lifetime. He noted that the seafloor between Malta and Sicily includes ridges and shelves at depths consistent with shoreline features that would have been above water during periods of lower sea level in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. He noted that the southern cliffs of Malta show signs of significant past collapse. He noted that the surrounding waters preserve at moderate depths what appear to be artificial structures whose interpretation remains contested. From these threads he wove an argument that the Maltese Islands are the surviving high ground of a once larger civilization centre, the lowlands of which now lie beneath the sea. Ellul was not alone. Anton Mifsud, the same Maltese physician who had pursued the question of the missing elongated skulls, took up a related line of inquiry. Working with his son Charles, and with several colleagues, Mifsud reviewed the geological evidence for past coastal change around the Maltese Islands, and argued in a series of small published volumes that the Maltese temple culture should be understood not as an isolated phenomenon on a small archipelago, but as the visible remnant of a much larger maritime culture whose principal sites had been lost to rising water. The argument was speculative. It rested on inferences that the available evidence could neither fully confirm nor fully refute, but it had the virtue of explaining, in a way that no conventional hypothesis quite managed, the otherwise puzzling sudden appearance of the trefoil temple plan on a small island, with no apparent precedents in the surrounding region. If the precedents had existed and now lay underwater, the appearance of the plan would no longer be puzzling. It would be the surfacing of a fragment of something larger. The argument intersects in interesting ways with the work of researchers operating in adjacent fields. The English engineer and writer Graham Hancock has, across a long and controversial career, argued for the existence of a lost maritime civilization of the late Pleistocene whose traces survive in scattered megalithic sites around the world. His arguments have been received with hostility by mainstream archaeology and with enthusiasm by the wider public. The dispute between Hancock and his academic critics has, in recent years, produced a body of debate so large that it has become almost a separate literature in its own right. The Maltese question forms one of many strands in that debate. Hancock himself has discussed the Maltese temples in several of his books and television programs, drawing on the work of Ellul and Mifsud, and has suggested that the islands may preserve, in fragmentary form, traces of a tradition older and wider than the conventional chronology admits. The academic response to all of this has been, in the main, dismissive. Conventional archaeology points to the absence of definitive submerged sites, to the consistency of the radiocarbon dates within the conventional chronology, and to the absence of any unambiguous evidence for a pre-Neolithic occupation of the Maltese Islands. The points are well taken. The conventional position is the cautious position, and caution is, in matters of historical reconstruction, generally the correct disposition, and yet, the patient observer, weighing the evidence with a willingness to hold contradictions in suspension, may find that the conventional position does not quite dispose of every uncomfortable detail. The sudden appearance of the trefoil plan remains unexplained by the conventional account. The acoustic precision of the hypogeum remains unexplained. The equinoctial alignment of Mnajdra, with its hint of a possibly earlier original configuration, remains unexplained. The folklore of giants, transmitted with such persistence through so many generations, remains unexplained. The reports of unusual skulls, withdrawn from independent examination, remain unexplained. Each one of these details is small. Each one of them, taken individually, admits a defensible conventional response. Taken together, they form a constellation that resists easy dismissal. They form, if one is willing to use the phrase without insisting on it, the shape of a missing chapter. Whether that chapter would, if recovered, prove to be Plato's Atlantis or some other lost tradition that has been compressed into the Atlantis legend by the simplifying memory of later cultures, is a question that cannot be answered with present evidence. The honest position is one of suspended judgment. Something happened in the central Mediterranean in remote antiquity. Something more, perhaps, than the conventional account is willing to admit. The Maltese temples are part of what happened. They are not the whole of it, and the rest of it, if it ever existed, lies beneath water whose depth has so far protected it from any conclusive examination. The sea, in its slow keeping, has been an effective custodian. What it keeps without apology and without explanation. And those who would persuade it to surrender its secrets must come with patience, equipment, and a willingness to find what they did not expect. On the western part of the main island, on a stretch of bare limestone that the Maltese call Misra Garil Kabir, the surface of the rock is cut by grooves that no satisfactory explanation has yet been found for. They run in pairs, 2 parallel furrows, each one a few centimetres deep and perhaps 15 centimetres wide, separated by a constant distance of approximately 1.5 metres. They cross the open limestone for hundreds of metres in some places, branching, intersecting, sometimes diverging into 2 parallel sets that run alongside each other, sometimes converging into a single track that disappears under the soil or vanishes over the edge of a cliff. They have been called, for as long as anyone has been writing about them in the modern period, the cart ruts of Malta. The name is provisional. No one is entirely certain that they are cart ruts at all. No one is entirely certain who made them, or when, or why. The most striking feature of the cart ruts, the feature that has earned the central area its alternative tourist name of Clapham Junction, after the London railway terminus, is the density of their intersections at certain places on the open limestone. Tracks cross, tracks branch, tracks join. At Clapham Junction, the limestone surface, viewed from a low altitude, resembles a railway yard. Dozens of separate pairs of grooves intersect and overlap. Some of them run for a metre or two and then disappear. Others run for hundreds of metres and continue under the modern cultivated soil at the edge of the limestone outcrop. A few of them, and this is the detail that has produced more speculation than any other single feature of the site, run directly off the edges of cliffs that descend to the sea, off the edges of cliffs, into the air. The cliffs in question are not gentle slopes. They are vertical drops, in some cases of considerable height, falling to rough shorelines below. The cart ruts approach the edge, continue to within a few metres of it, and end at the edge itself, as if the rock that once continued their course had subsequently been removed. In 1 or 2 instances, divers in the waters below have reported the continuation of similar grooves on the seafloor at depths consistent with the relative sea level of several thousand years ago. The reports have not been universally accepted. The underwater traces are difficult to verify. The visibility in shallow Mediterranean water is good in some seasons and poor in others. The divers who have observed the grooves are not always specialists in marine archaeology, and their identifications have been challenged. but the cliff-top ruts themselves are not in dispute. They exist, they were photographed and mapped by the British colonial authorities in the 19th century. They have been studied repeatedly by Maltese archaeologists, by visiting scholars from Italian and German universities, by independent researchers of various levels of credibility. The question of what made them, and when, has produced a long sequence of competing hypotheses, none of which has achieved general acceptance. The conventional hypothesis is that the ruts were made by the wheels of carts, drawn by oxen or by other beasts of burden, used to transport goods or building materials across the limestone surface from one part of the island to another. The hypothesis is straightforward. It accounts for the parallel pairing of the grooves and for the constant separation between them, which would correspond to a standard axle width. It accounts for the wearing of the rock by repeated passage along the same routes. It does not, however, account very well for several features of the actual evidence. The grooves are not the uniform shallow wear that wheels typically leave on stone roadways. They are deep U-shaped channels cut into the rock with a regularity that suggests intentional preparation more than gradual wear. The depth of the grooves in some places exceeds 20 centimetres. To produce such a groove by the passage of wheels alone, the wheels would have had to pass over the same spot tens of thousands of times, in precisely the same alignment, without the slightest deviation. The probability is low. Real wheel transport, observed across many cultures and many surfaces, produces broader and shallower wear patterns. The Maltese grooves do not look like wear. They look like channels. The alternative hypothesis, advanced by several researchers across the past century, is that the grooves are not ruts at all, but tracks, deliberately cut into the rock to guide the runners of some form of sledge or other transport device. The hypothesis has the merit of accounting for the depth and regularity of the grooves. It has the demerit of leaving open the question of what kind of sledge would have required so elaborate a network of guide tracks. The Maltese landscape is small, the distances involved are short. The investment of labour required to carve such a network into the bedrock seems disproportionate to any plausible transport need. A third hypothesis, raised in the 20th century and revived periodically since, is that the grooves were made not by transport but by water, by the channeling of rainwater across the limestone surface, perhaps with the assistance of human modification, in order to direct flow toward agricultural fields or storage cisterns. The hypothesis has its supporters, particularly among Maltese researchers familiar with the traditional water management of the island. It accounts for some of the features. It does not account for all of them. It does not, for example, account for the parallel pairing of the grooves, which would not be required for water management. A fourth hypothesis, raised more recently, suggests that the grooves served as guide channels for the transport of the great stone blocks used in the construction of the temples. The blocks would have been moved on sledges along prepared tracks, with the parallel grooves preventing lateral drift and ensuring that the load remained on the intended route. This hypothesis has gained some traction in recent decades. It accounts for the connection between the grooves and the temple culture. It accounts for the depth of the channels, which would have been required to constrain heavy loads. It does not, however, account for the grooves that lead to cliff edges or that disappear into the sea. If the grooves were used to transport temple stones, what destination at the edge of a cliff could possibly have justified the construction of a track to that point? And so the puzzle remains. The cart ruts of Malta have been mapped, debated, and partially understood, but not solved. They are extensive. By some estimates, the total length of identifiable grooves on the islands exceeds many kilometres. They suggest the existence, at some point in the past, of a network of routes that connected sites and destinations whose nature is no longer entirely clear. They suggest, in their continuation off cliffs and into the sea, the existence of a coastal geography different from the present. They suggest, in their depth and precision, a level of investment in transport infrastructure that the official account of a small Neolithic population does not quite seem able to accommodate. They are one more detail in a long sequence of details that fits awkwardly into the chronology that contemporary scholarship is prepared to defend. The patient observer walking the bare limestone at Misragar il-Kabir in the late afternoon light can trace one of the deeper pairs of grooves for several hundred metres before it disappears under a modern cultivated field. The grooves are too deep to walk in comfortably. The space between them is wide. Whoever or whatever moved along these tracks moved with weight, and moved often enough that the rock itself was reshaped to accommodate them. And the routes they took, when reconstructed across the landscape, do not match any obvious modern need or modern destination. They are the visible threads of a network whose remainder lies beneath soil, beneath cultivation, beneath the sea. A transport system for a world that no longer exists. After the temple culture ended, after the silence of 2 or 3 centuries had settled over the abandoned chambers, after the Bronze Age newcomers had set up their small huts in the shelter of the fallen lintels and the half-buried altars, the Maltese islands began the long sequence of overlayers that would, in time, render the original temple culture almost invisible to ordinary memory. The history of forgetting is, in many ways, more revealing than the history of remembering. To watch a culture disappear from the consciousness of its inheritors is to learn something about how human memory actually works. Not by faithful transmission, but by a slow series of erasures, each one performed by a new arrival who does not understand what is being erased. The Bronze Age people lived among the ruins. They did not record their understanding of them in any form that has survived. Their material culture suggests that they accorded the old temples little ritual significance. The pottery they left within the temple precincts is domestic, not votive. The huts they built using the older stones as foundation material show no particular reverence for the original orientations or alignments. They walked through the spaces, they camped in them, they moved on. By the time the next wave of overlayers arrived, sometime in the early first millennium before the Common Era, the temple culture had been gone for more than 1,000 years, and the Bronze Age camps had themselves largely been abandoned. The islands were nearly empty by some accounts. They were certainly empty enough that the next arrivals had no living tradition to negotiate. The next arrivals were the Phoenicians, maritime traders from the eastern Mediterranean, with a base of operations on the coast of what is now Lebanon. The Phoenicians established trading posts and small colonial settlements across the central and western Mediterranean during the early centuries of the first millennium before the Common Era. Malta, situated on the sea route between the eastern basin and the western, was a natural waypoint. They settled the islands. They left inscriptions in their own alphabetic script. They worshipped their own deities, including the goddess Astarte and the god Melkart, whose temples they constructed in the Phoenician style of the period. They did not, so far as the surviving evidence indicates, take any particular interest in the megalithic ruins that surrounded their new settlements. The trefoil temples were already, by the Phoenician period, very old. They had been abandoned for some 1,500 years. They were strange, they were inconvenient. The Phoenicians built their own sanctuaries elsewhere on their own terms and let the old stones lie. There is a fragment of evidence, however, that suggests the Phoenicians were not entirely indifferent. At the site of Tas Silg, on the southeastern coast of the main island, a Phoenician temple to the goddess Astarte was constructed directly on top of an earlier megalithic temple of the Maltese type. The Phoenician structure incorporated some of the older stones into its foundations. It reused part of the original layout. Whether this was due to the convenience of the existing site, the persistence of a local sacred geography that survived the gap in occupation, or some other reason cannot now be determined. But the pattern is suggestive. At least one of the megalithic temples retained, in the consciousness of the later arrivals, enough significance to be built upon rather than around. The newcomers did not understand what had been there before them. They understood perhaps that something had been there, and they placed their own sacred building on top of it, perhaps to claim it, perhaps to absorb whatever power the older site was thought to retain. The Romans came next. After the Punic Wars and the absorption of the central Mediterranean into the expanding Roman state, Malta became a Roman possession in the late 3rd century before the Common Era. The Romans built villas, they built roads, they left inscriptions in Latin. They incorporated the islands into the agricultural economy of the empire and produced wine and olive oil for export. They show no awareness of the megalithic temples as a category of monument distinct from any other ruin. The temples are not mentioned in any surviving Roman text. The visible standing stones by the Roman period were already buried to some depth by accumulated soil. What remained above the surface was strange, ancient, and unimportant to the practical concerns of Roman administration. The Roman period passed. The islands changed hands during the late antique disruptions, fell under Byzantine control, and were then taken by Arab forces in the late 9th century of the Common Era. The Arabs governed the islands for over 2 centuries, leaving a linguistic legacy that survives in the Maltese language to this day. They show no interest in the megalithic temples. The pattern of inattention continues without break. In the 11th century, the Norman conquest of Sicily brought Malta into the Christian European political world. The islands passed through a sequence of feudal arrangements until, in the early 16th century, they were granted by the Emperor Charles V to the Knights of the Order of St. John, who had recently been expelled from their previous base on the island of Rhodes by the expanding Ottoman Empire. The Knights ruled Malta for nearly 3 centuries. They built churches, palaces, fortifications, and the new capital city of Valletta. They left inscriptions in Latin, in Italian, and in their own internal documents. They show no interest in the megalithic temples. The temples, by the time of the Knights, had been incorporated into the agricultural landscape so completely that most of them were no longer recognizable as monuments at all. They were features of the terrain. They were obstacles to ploughing. They were the strange stones that village children climbed on. They were nothing more. It was not until the early 19th century, when Malta had passed from the Knights to the French, during the Napoleonic adventures, and then from the French to the British, that the systematic scientific interest in the megalithic remains began. The first proper excavation at Ġgantija on Gozo in 1827 has already been described. From that date forward, the temples began their slow re-emergence into modern consciousness, recovered piece by piece by a sequence of antiquarians and archaeologists who, for the first time in nearly 5,000 years, took an interest in what the old stones might have to say. The pattern, considered as a whole, is sobering. A culture builds. It builds at the largest scale and with the greatest precision that human prehistory in the Mediterranean would witness. It builds for 1,000 years. It vanishes. The next inhabitants do not understand what they have inherited. The inhabitants after that do not even recognize the inheritance as an inheritance. Successive layers of memory smooth over the original, until it is hidden beneath ordinary soil and ordinary indifference. Centuries pass during which the temples are nothing more than features of the landscape. A small island culture of farmers and traders and knights goes about its business above the silent chambers of the dead, with no awareness that anything significant lies beneath the fields they cultivate or beside the roads they travel. And then, with the random luck of a workman's pick or a scholar's curiosity, the buried thing comes out again into the light. It has been there all along. It was simply not seen, because no one had thought to look. It is the pattern that has always troubled the patient observer. What else has been there all along, in the soil of other islands and other coasts, that no one has yet thought to look for? What other temple traditions, what other cultures, lie at the same depth of forgetting, waiting for some accident or some restless mind to bring them back into the slow light of attention? The Maltese case is not unique in being lost. It is unique in being found again. And the finding of it suggests, more strongly than any single piece of evidence within it, that the surface of the recorded past is thinner than the standard accounts would have anyone believe. The depth is greater, and what lies beneath has not yet finished surfacing. There is a quality to the Maltese temples in moonlight that no photograph has yet succeeded in capturing. The daytime visitor sees them as the guidebooks present them. Megalithic structures of pale limestone weathered by time, fitted with the modern interpretive signs that explain the principal phases of construction and the conjectural functions of the principal chambers. The daytime visitor leaves with a sense of having understood something. But the temples, like many ancient things, have a different aspect when the tourists have gone and the small island has settled into its night. The limestone takes on the faint silver tint that only moonlight produces on weathered stone. The shadows in the trefoil chambers deepen until the carved spirals seem to recede into a darkness that has no measurable bottom. The wind moves through the open doorways with the soft persistence that the same wind has had for 5,500 years, and the stones stand where the unknown builders placed them, in positions that the official chronology has not yet adequately explained, doing what they have done since the beginning, which is to wait. What they wait for, no one knows. It is possible, of course, that they wait for nothing, that they are simply old stones, set in particular configurations for purposes that the people who set them understood completely, and that have been forgotten only because forgetting is what time does. The conventional account is the calm account. It explains what it can explain. It admits, sometimes more openly than its critics allow, what it cannot. The temples were built by a Neolithic farming culture of the central Mediterranean. They were aligned to the seasons because the seasons mattered to a farming culture. They contained figurines of fertility because fertility mattered to a farming culture. They incorporated chambers for the dead because the dead always matter. The culture ended for reasons that the available evidence does not permit certainty about, but that probably involve some combination of climate, disease, social exhaustion, and the small accidents that compound to extinguish small populations on small islands. There is no need, in this account, to invoke giants, lost civilizations, ancient acoustic technology, or any other element of the speculative literature. The account is sufficient. The account is, in the proper scientific sense, parsimonious, and yet the patient observer, having weighed all of this, having sat through the long sequence of details that the careful exposition has set out, may find that the parsimonious account has the strange quality of accounting for nearly everything, while satisfying almost nothing. The dates are explained, the architecture is explained, the figurines are explained, the dead are explained, the end is explained, and still, when one has read the explanations and walked the temples and stood in the chambers of the Hypogeum, something remains unaccounted for, a residue, a small unaccountable surplus that the conventional account does not quite absorb. The folklore of giants persists, the acoustic precision of the oracle chamber persists, the equinoctial light at Mnajdra persists, the cart ruts that lead into the sea persist. The skulls that were photographed and then disappeared persist. The trefoil plan that has no parents and no children persists. Each detail is small. The accumulation of the details is not small. It is at this point that the older question returns, the question with which this long inquiry began. Whether the story of human history, as it is taught and retold, may be missing entire chapters, whether some of those missing chapters lie in plain sight, on small islands in warm seas, in stones that have been waiting for the right kind of attention. The Maltese case does not answer the question definitively in either direction. It does not prove the existence of a lost civilization. It does not prove the existence of a tradition of practical knowledge older than the conventional chronology admits. It does not prove anything that the alternative literature would wish it to prove. What it does is something more modest and perhaps more important. It demonstrates that even within the territory of the most carefully studied archaeology, there are details that do not quite fit. There are pieces that the picture does not quite accommodate. There are absences in the record that the standard account smooths over but does not fully explain. What follows from this is not a program of belief. It is a disposition of patient attention to the small awkward details that the confident summaries pass over, a willingness to hold contradictions in suspension without forcing them to a premature resolution, a recognition that the human past, like the human present, is more strange than any of its surviving accounts have managed to convey. The temples of Malta do not require the visitor to believe in Atlantis, in giants, or in lost civilizations of prehistoric advancement. They require only that the visitor look at them carefully and notice what they are, and notice what they are not. What they are is a body of monumental architecture older than any other freestanding stone construction on Earth, built by a small population on a small island, with technical and astronomical knowledge that no obvious chain of transmission can fully account for. What they are not is solved. They are not solved in the sense in which a problem in mathematics is solved, by a demonstration that closes the question. They remain open. They remain available to further inquiry. They remain, in some quiet sense, waiting. The cycle of remembering and forgetting that has run across the Maltese islands for 5,500 years is not unique to those islands. It is the universal condition of human cultural memory. Cultures build. Cultures vanish. The cultures that come after them do not understand what they have inherited. Successive layers of forgetting accumulate until the original is buried beneath ordinary soil, and then, by some accident or some restless act of looking, the buried thing comes out again into the light. It has been there all along. It has been waiting all along. It has been waiting for someone to ask the right question. The right question, in the Maltese case, may not be the question that anyone has yet asked. It may be a question that has not yet occurred to the disciplined imagination that approaches the temples from the side of conventional archaeology, nor to the freer imagination that approaches them from the side of alternative speculation. It may be a question that will only become askable when some further detail emerges from the soil, or from the sea, or from the archives in which old reports have been allowed to fade. Whatever the question is, the stones will still be there when it's finally posed. They have been waiting for 5,500 years. They have waited through the rise and fall of every civilization that the Mediterranean has produced. They have waited through the Phoenicians and the Romans and the Arabs and the Knights and the British, and through the modern republic that now protects them with climate-controlled glass and electronic admission systems. They are very patient. Somewhere on the southern coast of the main island, on the cliff above Mnajdra, a single upright stone leans slightly toward the sea. The angle of its lean has not changed in any measurable way since the first modern survey recorded it in the 19th century. The stone is taller than a man. It is broader than two men together. It was set in its present position by people whose names no one knows, in a place whose sea level was different from the present sea level, purposes that no surviving record adequately describes. It catches the light of the rising sun on certain mornings of the year. It catches the light of the rising moon on certain other nights, and for the rest of the time, when no one is watching, it simply stands. Stands as it has stood, waits as it has waited, and the warm sea below it, which has kept its long counsel for as long as the stone has stood above the waves, continues to keep that counsel still.